Hi everyone, and welcome once again to another Does It Make a Difference podcast. And it's my pleasure this time to have the subject of podcasting. Does it make a difference? Now, my guest today is Colin Gray, who is the owner of thepodcasthost.com. And he has now turned his interest in podcasts, the same as mine over the last 15 or 20 years, into helping people start podcasts and take their podcast to the next level. So welcome to the show, Colin.
Hey, good to be here. Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Well, it's good to actually have this conversation with somebody that's been in the industry as long as me, and try and sort of reflect on the people that we've helped over the years take their podcast to different levels. So just to give people a bit of a background, what was it like when you first started doing the podcast yourself?
Oh, I mean, it was horrible. Of course, the technology was just terrible. Yeah, it was around 2008 I created my first ever show, I think, and hosting at the time was just like so archaic. Even listening was quite bad. Do you remember the time, Bob, when it was like you had to actually have an MP3 player, a separate little device that you plugged into your computer, you manually drag across episodes onto that. And then you had to kind of remember what you'd listened to, drag them off, then drag on the new. It was just an awful experience back then. So it always surprises me that the thing took off. But you know, as well as I, improved so much over the 5 years or so going on from that. But yeah, so much better these days, so much easier.
Well, my recollection is my first one was recorded on a mini disc. So
yes.
on a portable mini disc recorder when I was out and about doing my interviews, and like you say, it was then editing on the machines at the time, and certainly I felt I could do a phone interview. I could do a phone interview, do the editing, and upload it and get it completely finished within 3 or 4 hours, which was exciting because I was due down to the pub to see my friends usually in the evening at that particular time. So it worked perfectly from a timing point of view. But then they invented social media, and all the time suddenly went, and that really has changed things. So you're helping people now, obviously, start the podcast for the first time, go through what we went through, but without all the pain. What sort of questions are you being asked? What's the common starting question you get asked these days?
Do you know, the most surprising thing is how little that's changed actually over the last 15 years or so. It's still really around editing. It's still really around how you actually put the show together more than anything else. So it's like, how do I make that easier? How do I make it take less time? How do I figure out this whole discipline, which is audio engineering? So that's the stuff really that people struggle with the most, I think, mainly because it's so time consuming and sort of techie as well. But beyond that, it comes down to things like, what equipment do I need for it? What's the best microphone? And then really, it's only after that, and people get it back to front a little bit, but it's only after that they get down to, what am I going to talk about? What's my audience going to be? What's my actual focus, my uniqueness? How am I going to market this thing, grow it? So yeah, that's kind of generally the priorities we get these days.
So how about things like imposter syndrome and people getting used to the sound of their own voice? Do you think because people are using mobile phones these days and recording themselves doing a whole variety of things, they're actually more comfortable with that?
I think it helps. Yeah, people are a little bit more comfortable in general with being recorded, of course, but it still comes up. It does still come up a lot, and it's always the trickiest part of the first 5 to 10 episodes, isn't it? Getting over that feeling of listening to yourself. But I don't know. There's never a good answer to that other than just do it and actually just get those first 10 episodes out and reassuring people that every person goes through the same thing. But by 10 episodes in, you'll be used to it. You'll be comfortable with your own voice. Generally, you'll have found it by that point, and you can move on from there with much more confidence.
So looking at, say, 15 years ago when you first started, the audience was growing, the interest was growing, but there wasn't that much competition. So how does that differ to starting a podcast these days?
I think a lot of people worry about competition. They think about the fact that there are, 10 times more podcasts, 100 times more than the very early days, but there's still so few compared to nearly any other channel out there. There's tens of millions of channels on YouTube. There's hundreds of millions of blogs out there, tens of millions of social media channels, all that kind of stuff. So the competition is still really low in podcasting compared to any others. I often end up looking for podcasts on certain subjects, whether it's for someone I'm interested in or whether it's some kind of client research. And still, I find niches where there's like only one or two, or even sometimes no shows covering a particular angle. So there's still so much more space, I think, in podcasting. It's still one of the least crowded content channels out there, I believe.
I think it's probably just the illusion then, is because if you're something like a iTunes user, that when you go and search for a podcast, you just get hit by this big screen of icons and thumbnails.
Yeah. I think that comes down to making sure that when you're getting out there and creating a podcast, and this is probably even more relevant for a business podcast than anything else, for example, is what is your unique angle? What is your unique topic? And as soon as you start to drill down, you realize how, as soon as you go quite specialized, as soon as you find your angle on something, then you're just in, category of one. It's just yourself. So I think it's about digging in and making sure you have that uniqueness there.
So what would be your main tip then for people that are actually searching for a particular podcast? What is the best search method or platform to go on to, as you say, drill down?
So the app I love is Pocket Casts, actually. I always forget the name because there's so many of them out there, but that's the one that I often come back to because its search is really good. It's really good for surfacing great shows. It's actually got one of the best, discoverability elements to it, in that it has a good catalog that showcases new shows on trend, all that kind of stuff. So I always find that I can find a good new listen using the general browsing, but equally get into the search tools and you can find topics like whatever it is you're looking for, whatever speciality you need.
Oh, I haven't tried that one, so I'll give that one a go. That sounds interesting. So these days, then, looking at people that want to start a podcast, and hopefully that's what people are watching and getting the most for from watching this particular video podcast. What do you advise people at the stages they need to consider to go through?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that people always skip is that planning element where they figure out, really, I tend to think of it as a 3-part process, whereby you've got the topic first. So you think about what topic it is you're going to cover. That usually comes naturally because you know what you're interested in, you know what you want to talk about in a general sense. If you're a business type, education type show, it's probably going to be something related to the product you sell or the service you offer, something like that. And it's all related to the audience, really. It's like, who are your target audience? Who are your customers? What do they come to you for? And from there, you start to drill down, because the part that people often miss out is then thinking about both the problem that you're solving, the solution to that problem, and then the unique angle that you're going to put on that as well. Because you can always talk about the products, the services, all that kind of stuff, but unless you're actually solving a problem for that customer, there's no point in them listening. They're not going to come along. They're not going to spend the time with you. So it's digging into really, maybe even getting quite specific. If you're a healthcare business, maybe you do health and fitness or something like that. You help people with nutrition, with strength training, with cardio, all that kind of stuff. Maybe you only choose one part of it and you do nutrition to start with. So you think, right, I'm going to teach people how to eat better on my podcast. So you put that out there. You think the problem I'm going to solve is, how do I eat better? Just during the week, I'm busy. I'm going to solve that. That's the solution I'm going to offer. But that is one area where there actually is more competition than average on podcasts. So again, you want to drill down, make yourself a category of one. And that's when it comes to the uniqueness. That's when it comes to drilling down into what's your angle on it. There's a few different ways to do that. Maybe it's something like your background. Maybe it's like you used to be very overweight and you got back down to a decent weight. So you can go from your experience and talk people through that story. Or maybe it's something like an angle you have on it in terms of demographics. So maybe you're 60 and you want to do actually nutrition for older people, particular angles on it for that type of person, somebody in that age range. That's another way to make it unique. So there's all these different ways that you can take an angle on it. You can do different formats. You can do like a really short podcast compared to a very long podcast. There's all sorts of ways. But that is the part that I often find people miss out, because that's what then goes into the marketing and the growth. Because as soon as you've got that unique angle and you know the exact problem that you're solving, not only can you capture people because you're saying, right, here's the answer I'm going to give you. Here's the thing, the pain I'm going to solve for you. But here's why my show is the one that you should listen to, as opposed to all these other ones that are out there. So there's that whole process that you can go through that really makes it so much easier to actually attract people to listen to your show.
Yeah. I mean, the podcast I started years ago, which was sort of consumer product related, I made the mistake of doing a typical features benefit type content relating to a handful of products and basically saying what was new or whatever else and what was, the particular feature. But really, it didn't give any particular benefit to people at all. And I learned very quickly that actually was the biggest turn-off for clients than actually, as you were saying, sort of telling a story, but also solving a problem. Or at least, if you're not solving a problem, giving somebody a freebie, a free bit of knowledge or a free bit of understanding, really, to allow them to consider your input as being worth of value to them.
That's really interesting. How did you discover that? Was that through conversations with your listeners? Was that just through listening, really?
That was partly conversations, but predominantly, actually, it was just download figures. It was very interesting how the download figures showed very clearly straight away that the percentage-wise, I mean, this is off the top of my head from years ago, but I would say probably it was only 10 or 20% of the normal download figures. People realised very quickly what it was, and they just didn't really show any interest in it. And thinking about it, I mean, continuing that subject a bit further, I've done a whole variety of content, so story content, and I've done interview content, and I've done trade shows. And interestingly, although the trade shows have been about products which I know will be of interest to the listeners because that's the industry that I was talking to, the figures don't indicate that they're actually anywhere near as popular as talking to people. I like to describe it as normal people doing interesting things.
Yeah.
And that's definitely got the biggest audience.
Yeah, it really showcases something. Do you know, it's important for any podcast, this, but actually I think even more so for a business type podcast is the experimentation, because you never quite know exactly what's going to hit. With a branded podcast in particular, you really have to try, I think, a whole lot of different things and have a real experimentation mindset. The first 20, 30 episodes, try all sorts of different formats, all sorts of different types of approach to your content, and really listen out hard to what people are saying. Like, make it very easy for people to feed back to you, so that you can watch the download numbers, like you're saying, they're a really good indication, but actually make it really easy for people to tell you as well what they're liking, what they're not liking. And then, iterate on that feedback and really make a difference because of that.
Well, that leads me on to something else, really, because, again, historically speaking, nobody's going to be that interested in 20 years ago. But 20 years ago, Facebook hadn't really started, and YouTube had only just started as well. So it wasn't part of, Instagram and LinkedIn and just, were just still in their infancy, if that. Yeah. So the actual chance of getting feedback was really waiting for an email. You weren't getting sort of content feedback. But now, of course, it's much more complicated in the sense that that when you do your content, that's one thing. You've got an idea of your audience that you're doing it for. That's another thing. Then there, as you say, the interacting with the audience, and all of a sudden you've got this plethora of platforms which you feel you have to service.
Yeah.
With your content. I mean, what do you advise your customers on that, your clients?
Oh, it's painful. It is. It's really difficult because it becomes it is a full-time job. It's more than a full-time job. Like, people who go heavy on that, trying to cover everything, employ a few people for that. You can have a team of half a dozen to manage all of your social media, all of the extra promotion. It's a bit of a hobby horse of mine at the moment, is trying to convince people to do less, because I've seen a lot of podcasts in the last 3-4 years, the last couple of years particularly, either dying off or not starting at all, primarily because of video, because they feel like they have to do video. And video is great in some contexts. Like, you're doing it really nicely here, Bob. Like, we've got a really nice setup, it well, it's part of what you do. But for a lot of people, it's really difficult. Like, they don't understand camera, lighting, the editing can be really tricky as well. But they try and do it because they feel like they have to, just like you've suggested there. Like, it's a kind of pressure that it has to include video or it's not going to grow. And it's just not true. There's still so many shows out there growing so nicely, so well, audio only. So much of the video podcast that goes out there is so low quality that people don't even watch the video; they just listen to the audio in the background anyway. So it's really tricky that way. So that's just one part of it. But social is the same. Matthew, actually, one of my partners in the company, he just put out a growth guide, which is titled "How to Grow a Podcast Without Social." He's got a big thing against social in terms of he's not on any social. He doesn't get involved in it. He sees it as quite damaging. He's very much on the anti-social. He has friends, but anti-social media end of the scale, which is tricky because you do feel that pressure to use it. But he's proven time and time again that you can grow a podcast that way, and he's put out a deliberate article, lots of training around how to do it without social to show people that it is possible and to not feel that pressure. So yeah, I think it is about making sure that you don't feel pressured into doing something just because you feel like you should, and only really living in the places where you live anyway, as in yourself with video, Bob, him, Matthew, just in the world of podcasting and long form. Other people, they do live in social, and that is totally fine, and they can grow a podcast through social media really well, but many don't. So yeah, I think that's how I see it.
Okay, well, I mean, two questions come out of that. Firstly, what's it sort of roughly his advice if you do it without social? And secondly, how is it best to maximise if you are heavily into your social?
Yeah, I mean, without social, like a big part of Matthew's guide is around really collaborations are still so powerful. One of the real early days, you'll remember this, Paul, in the early days of podcasting, like how often was it just you grew through going on other people's shows, doing interviews, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. I mean, that was just the seen as the big technique. That doesn't work so well anymore because there's a whole big interview circle and people don't really promote stuff they go on to anymore so much. But there's so many more levels of collaboration that you can do, such as co-hosted episodes where you actually create it for both audiences and there's equal value to post it on your feed as there is on theirs. Or promotion swaps where you put a little clip from me on your show and I put a little clip from you on mine. And there's so many different variations of that whereby if you get the right audience overlap, which is quite easy to find, there's loads of ways you can do that. As long as there's a decent overlap, you can get so many listeners graduating from one to the other and listening to both shows. Because someone who likes a podcast is going to listen to a few podcasts about that subject. So it's not like we're in full competition or anything. So that's just one part of it. But there's a bunch of other ways you can still do it without social media, I would say.
Right. Okay. And your advice regarding using social, I mean, that in itself, I find that a bit of a dark art, to be honest. And I think, I'm a little bit on the mature side, should we say, and I don't really get the grasp of it. And I've been lucky enough to interview a few people who are well in tune, and it does make me realise even more that I'm completely out of touch, even though I think I'm on the fringes.
I think so. That is what it comes down to, is the fact that you have to be living it to make it work. I think the people I've seen make it work are the ones that are posting for fun anyway, and they know what their audience loves. They're so practiced at it, they don't need to force it. And then the ones that don't are like a brand that comes along and says, "Oh, we have to do social media," and therefore they're kind of trying to crowbar it in, and they don't. It just doesn't resonate with people because they don't quite understand the medium. So the main advice I think for doing social media is it has to be somewhere you live, that you understand, that you live and breathe, and it's very difficult to do otherwise. I would suggest the only people that I've seen do it well that don't live and breathe it are ones that have employed somebody who does. You need a social media manager that knows it so well, but equally can get to know the real character behind your company and communicate those values, that character through their own social media techniques. And then it comes down to, I mean, there's no denying that video clipping is working quite well, if done well right now. So, I mean, that's one of the standard techniques, getting that on TikTok, on YouTube Shorts, that kind of stuff, graduating that onto the more text-based ones as well. But, I mean, that is hard. That is time-consuming. That is a full-time job to do that well. Because, I don't know about you, have you tried many of the AI tools for this yet, Bob? I've found they don't work very well. What about you?
Well, I listened to your interview with Mike and followed up some of the AI links that were attached to that show. And I was absolutely blown away by the potential. Yes. The one that I actually thought would be quite useful to my future plans was the AI tool which would take URLs of press releases and read them in a human voice, which I found absolutely excellent.
Yeah.
And I could see that if you were in industry, for example, and you wanted to make a filler podcast that was in your own voice, because obviously this AI tool will take your voice and then read the article in your voice, which I thought was just mind blowing. That was the bit that really did shock me. But if you were producing, say, for a podcast, and then every third or fourth episode was a little news piece about the latest product release, new car, whatever it may be, that was relevant to your industry, what a way to just create a quick, as Mike was doing it, quick 5-minute piece that was the latest news update from that particular industry. Fantastic. But aside from that, I just don't feel there's that humanness, the human errors, the ums and the ers that actually go to make it authentic.
I think that's exactly how to think. That's how I'm thinking about it. And I think that's how anyone who's optimistic about it is thinking about AI and content just now, is that it's an assistant, it's an addition, it's not a replacement. So yeah, say I do a 30-minute podcast every week, I could add a little 2-3 minute clip, which is my AI newsreader reading a couple of updates. Absolutely. That's a nice little enhancement provided by AI. The clipping tools I've found just, you give them an hour's worth of interview, a conversation like this, and you ask it to pick out the highlights, the most interesting parts. It might give you 20 clips and it'll hit on one that happens to be decent, but it's not got the humanity, it's not got the interest, it's not got the actual, the taste to be able to pick out genuinely interesting, captivating parts. So the people that are making that work are the ones that are actually spending 2, 3, 4 hours listening through an episode and really ferreting in on the parts that will resonate with their audience. It's a really hard thing to do.
So really what it comes down to is I think people need to be aware of how much time it's involved. You've got to, I think before you start a podcast, you need to respect your time. So if you're doing it for fun, the time you're putting into it needs to be time that you're happy to allocate to it, and that's it. But if you're doing it for business, then you need to respect that if you're going to do it for business and do it to a level that's going to create business, particularly if you're going to do all these shorts and all these repurposing and all the texting and conversion to other formats, it's going to take a lot longer than you might think. Or if you're paying somebody else for that, it's going to add up.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's it. It's about how to try and figure out how to make it sustainable. It's about figuring out what you can actually commit to the week. Like, that's the biggest thing I think people struggle with, is how to create a workflow that really suits their situation. And the big pitfall is, of course, just as we were talking about, trying to fit too many things in, thinking you have to do all these things. But it's just not true. Like, you can figure out a workflow that can get a good podcast out in under an hour a week if you try. If that's what if that's the time you have, then you do as much as you can within that time and you get it out. And then you see 3 months later, is this starting to gain momentum? What can I do? Can I cut something down? Can I add something else in? It's really just about that, like figuring out that routine, that workflow, and making sure you prioritize every single week. And yeah, absolutely, outsource as much as you can, for sure. But I've seen people do it all by themselves, and just making sure that there's no perfectionism that's kind of dragging them down. So yeah, it's a tricky one though.
Okay, so for people watching this then, what are your 3 top tips for creating a successful podcast? How would you summarize it?
I mean, I think the biggest pitfall is always the gear. It's always the equipment and the technology. People making it far too complicated. So top tip always is just to try and keep things as simple as humanly possible. As soon as you buy a 500 quid microphone, a mixer, and all sorts of different things that go around it, there's always more things to break every time you try and record. Like, the biggest win in podcasting is if you have a setup which you can just literally have an idea and go, oh, right, hit record, and it's just going, and that's it. You don't have to fiddle with any settings. You don't have to plug anything in. It's just there and working. That is the biggest win in podcasting. And the second is really that planning. Like, make sure you have that unique aspect. Like, make sure you've dug into your audience and really see what you can say to them about, they go, well, why your show? Why should I listen to your show? You're like, well, because of this. If you don't have that, you're going to struggle throughout. So yeah, that's a couple of the biggest ones really. And I suppose the third, in terms of editing, keeping that simple as well, actually is really important. I've got a framework I teach people called the ME framework, MEE, minimum effective editing. And it's about the least you can do to your audio and your show to get it out there and sound totally fine. And a big part of that is I often talk about taking a live recording mindset into your recordings, whereby you pretend almost that you've gone live, like you're broadcasting, streaming live, and therefore you just go for it. And imperfections and all, like you just keep them in there. You stumble over your words and you're like, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to say that, but that's fine because it's human and it's part of why people connect with us because we're not over sanitizing our recordings. If you do that, then at the end of the day, you can just do a quick top and tail at the end of the show. You can maybe cut out any massive mistakes if you really need to, but try and avoid that altogether. Put it through an audio cleanup, like Alitu, our tool does that. It just cleans up all the audio automatically, takes out all the background noise, but there's tons of other options out there too. And that's it. You throw it out there into the world. And that's really it. That's the content. It's the content that matters rather than the tech. So as long as you give it that kind of minimum effective edit, you can put it out in the world in far fewer time, far less time.
Yeah, and in actual fact, you've described exactly how I've made best part of 500 podcasts in the outdoor industry.
Good stuff,
keeping it very simple, because the more equipment you carry with you, the more things, as you rightly say, can go wrong, or batteries can go flat. And sometimes, actually, when you listen to people's content, which has been almost over processed, it doesn't sound organic enough to grab your attention.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Yeah, there is something about like the vulnerability or transparency of mistakes, of slipping over a word or making a mistake or saying every now and again. And of course, it can go too far. Like if you say or crutch words far too much, it does become annoying. But I actually think the live recording mindset helps with that, because if you commit to minimal editing and then listen back to a few episodes, you're not going to use editing as a crutch. It means that you have to improve. You have to become a better speaker. You have to try and cut down those ums by thinking about, oh, I'll take a breath at the end of a sentence rather than say or I say or basically too much. So every time that comes into my head, I try and pause and not say it. It improves your speaking style and your cadence and all that stuff so much, so quickly when you commit to no editing, because you just don't have it there as a safety net.
Yeah. I think the advice I generally give people is that the first few episodes of anything, whether it's video or audio or even just photography, when you're looking at pictures of yourself, you see yourself and you are self-critical, or you hear yourself, or you watch the video. But after a while, you stop seeing you as an individual and you start seeing the whole picture or listening to the whole thing. And you then listen to the story as opposed to the person telling the story. And it takes different people a while to get to that stage, but it doesn't take very long. And I think when their enthusiasm is to obviously to share their story or whatever it is they're sharing information wise, then it does come across, and it's the enthusiasm that comes across rather than their personal, tics, their audio tics, whatever it may be.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's what you want to get to, isn't it? It's you're not even thinking about the microphone. You're not thinking about the recording. You're just talking as if to a friend. I've seen people do funny tricks here. Like you get some people that put a photo on the wall behind their microphone and pretend you're speaking to that person. That photo is a representation of your ideal listener. Maybe it's a real person. Maybe it's somebody made up, or even a teddy bear on a chair behind the microphone, and that's the personification of the person you're speaking to. But yeah, whatever you can do to make it so that you're forgetting about that technology, forgetting about the process you're going through, and just speaking like you would to a friend, that's what makes the best content.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so the ambitious people who have gone through all this stage that we've been talking about, this getting into it and getting over imposter syndrome and getting confident about what they're producing, however they've decided to produce it, whether it's basic or straightforward or more advanced. The next question people automatically ask, and I'm sure you've had this many a time, and I'm interested in your answer to this, is how do you make money from a podcast?
Good question. Well, I mean, there's all sorts of different ways. It depends a lot on who you are, what your context is. I mean, if you run a business already, then the purpose of the podcast is to grow that brand, to sell the products and the services. And there's a few different ways to go about that. If you're an individual, you want to turn it into a media company, essentially. You're growing the podcast, and the podcast is a product. You can do things like sponsorship, affiliate income. You can create products around it or services too. Brand deals work really nicely as well. And then if you're just a hobbyist, then often just actually listener supported methods work really nicely there, which can be things like donations, or things like a Patreon where people subscribe and just support the show and get small rewards in return, or small sponsorships too. So happy to talk about detail of any of them, Bob, if they're interesting, but that's kind of a broad strokes version.
Okay, yeah, well, that obviously works. But I mean, the other side is the assumption is, will you need a massive audience to actually achieve that?
No, so yeah, absolutely. There's a continuum. You go from different methods that work more nicely for big audiences. So sponsorship and advertising type of stuff really needs big audiences generally, unless of course you have a really specific niche audience. So for example, with your outdoor sports show, like that's such a outdoor equipment show, that's such a kind of niche audience that you can actually sell advertising to an audience, to a manufacturer of some kind of outdoor gear, because the audience is so targeted. Did you work with that? Did you try that technique while you were running your show?
Well, the idea behind the show was to support the online shop that we had at the time, which has all now come to an end. So I never worked hard at it from a commercial point of view. It's actually more fun for me because I enjoyed the media side, and also it was a good excuse to talk to a lot of interesting people, as I say, doing interesting things. So it worked as a supporting mechanism, an awareness mechanism is the way I approached it. But it certainly peaked at one stage where the actual download figures were more than any of the magazines, the UK magazines in the industry. And that's when I could have monetized it in some way. But I chose not to. So it's changed. Things are changing now, but that's the stages I went through and the reasons I chose not to monetize it at the time.
Yeah, that showcases a couple of methods. Yeah, if you're a business and you can create great content that reaches your exact target audience, then that can work really nicely, like you're saying there. But equally, if you're creating content that reaches that really targeted audience, then you can find a business that wants to get in front of them. The thing is, the CPM model is kind of broken almost in a way for any podcast or any content outlet that is nicely niche. It works really well for a general podcast like the Joe Rogan show or Tim Ferriss or whatever. They're basically, their audience is just about anyone that's interested in interesting content, and therefore anyone advertising, they're only going to convert a small percentage of the people that listen to that show. But if you find a show that then has a really targeted audience like outdoor gear or something like that, then somebody that sells outdoor trainers is going to convert far more of that audience to buy, and therefore it's worth so much more to them. So yeah, lots of different ways on that scale.
So, Colin, thanks very much indeed for your time on this, and I wish you well with the podcasthost.com. If people are interested in following that through, the information will be on the screen and in the show notes. But of all the questions I could have asked you about creating podcasts and podcasts in general, what should I have asked you?
Oh, good question. I wonder if it's something around the often under considered but super important one is what happens to a show when it actually succeeds but plateaus in many ways. Like, we've worked with a few people like that over the years. Certainly we've gone through it with some of the shows that we run as well, whereby a show is working and it's doing nicely, and you kind of get into a rut, and you're on episode 100 and your audience is maybe a few thousand listeners per episode or something. It's a nice audience, but it's not massive, but it's decent. And what do you do at that point? Because you kind of settle into something, and I've seen many shows do this where they just stop growing very well because they stop changing much, and they kind of just get used to doing the same thing every time. So there's definitely something around making sure that you build into your processes almost a review or a kick in the seat of your pants or something or other every few months, where you look at what you're doing and you say, if I was starting this show today, is this what I would do? Like, is this still exactly what my audience wants and needs? Because in any place, of any of the places out there where people consume content, like podcasting, video, blogging, they change fast. So people want different things and it changes. And I've seen many podcasts become irrelevant over the years because they've failed to kind of stop and do that. And people have become bored with it as well. There's something about the personal side of it too, and the enthusiasm to actually keep it up, because it's such a personal one-to-one medium, that enthusiasm has to be there. You have to be there. You have to check in every single time you're recording and really put yourself into it. Otherwise, the listeners can hear it through your voice. You're with them for a year, like an hour at a time, in their ears. They can hear it when you're lower energy. So there's something about even just mixing things up to keep your own enthusiasm going as well. So it's a more kind of ephemeral topic, I think, but that's something I think about a lot actually, is how to build that into processes, because it has to be a long-term thing and it's not like every week, but it's definitely something to think about, I think.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, there's two things that come out of that comment. I've certainly had hiatus where I've had great enthusiasm and been producing content left, right, and centre, and then, in fact, the last 12 months I've taken a back seat and just let it go because I'd run out of steam. But the other thing as well, having created something for so long, and you'll probably find this in your case as well, your audience would be, if they're listening to you to get value from the show of your content for whatever reason, that audience will learn and move on. So if they've learned what they need to learn in their particular area of interest, or that particular area of interest has changed, they're not interested in that anymore, they're not interested in surfing or climbing or whatever it may be, they've moved on. And I think the one thing that I made the mistake of, and I'm now trying to rectify that, and perhaps people that have had content going for some time need to consider, which ties in with what you've just said, is that you need to think there is a new audience coming to you all the time. And so you need to cater for them, not just repeat the content that's taking your old audience and takes it forward. So you have to sort of include the newbies, whoever the newbies are and what they're interested in your story.
Yeah. It's funny you say that, because it's something that I was talking to one of my team about just last week, actually. A show that we've ran for a little while now called The Creator Toolbox. And we're refocusing that a bit to be more, well, it's a tricky thing to be able to bring in new listeners, brand new to that area. So we're talking to creators, for example. We want to be able to onboard new creators, help them set up their creator business, figure out what they do, but equally keep the older people, the more experienced people interested, because you don't want them to churn out. You want them to be with you forever. And it is really hard. But I think there's just a big thing about keeping both of those people in mind. And every time a topic comes up, often as an expert in the area, you can figure out a way to, give the beginner's guide in just a minute, but then go on to what that means to more experienced people as well, and be able to go into both levels really, so that you're giving the beginners that context they need, but equally you're showing them where they could go with this expert content, but then the experts still get a lot from that content as well. So we're trying to figure out that balance just now, but you're absolutely right. It's a tricky one, and it has to be in your mind throughout.
So I think we all agree basically that no matter whether it's a one person doing it purely for fun or you're doing it more commercially, you have become a media company. And just like the BBC, you have to make all your decisions, except you don't have a team. You're a team of one and you've got to do everything. So there's part of the challenge as well.
Aye, absolutely. Yeah, we're competing with, well, I don't know. I don't consider myself competing with them too much, but you're absolutely right. We're competing with everything that has people's attention, don't we?
Yeah,
so, yeah, absolutely. The best we can.
Well, there you go, folks. Thanks very much indeed to Colin. If you want to find out more about him and the services he offers, do have a look at the website, thepodcasthost.com. And that's it for this particular podcast. I hope that's been of interest to you, and I look forward to seeing you again next time. Thanks for watching, and take care.